Okay, everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in a few minutes past the hour. We're just waiting for a few more folks to log in. So now would be a good time to go to the bathroom, settle in, grab a snack, get a beverage, and we'll get started shortly. So hang in there and talk to you in a few. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining our second President Society webinar of 2019. We're waiting for a few more folks to log in, so while we wait, a few updates. We're on a record-setting pace for President Society this year, which is very exciting, but we still need your help. Members like you fund nearly 70% of AMC's annual fund, which makes our conservation, recreation, and education programs possible. Your donation to President Society is the fuel for the AMC fire. Through your generosity, you won Northern Pass, you build and maintain nearly 2,000 miles of trails, and you connect thousands of people to the outdoors every single year. If you haven't given yet, now is the time to do so. You can send a check by mail to 10 City Square, the full address is up on the screen, or you can give online at outdoors.org/joinps. One alternative method for giving for those of you over 70.5 years of age is by making a donation through your IRA. That's the required minimum distribution, and we're seeing a lot more of these, which is really exciting. It's another great way to continue your support for AMC while getting a tax benefit. All right, so before I turn the webinar over to our panelists, a few notes on the format. This is a special perk for our President Society and Summit Trust members, and we hope you'll enjoy this opportunity to learn more about the organization, conservation, and how we're living the mission. Our presentation today will run around 45 minutes, and a recording will be available afterwards. There are handouts with more information in the sidebar, and we'll make a PDF version of the slides available after the presentation. Some of you have sent questions in already, so thank you so much for doing so. And you can also submit questions during the presentation on the questions sidebar. We'll have clarification questions after each section, and then save big picture questions for the end so our panelists can really take a deeper dive. The sidebar should appear as a window on the right-hand side of your monitor, and it might be hidden as a triangle pointing down, so just experiment with that for a little bit. All right, and now the moment we've all been waiting for. It is my huge honor to introduce Susan Arnold, our Vice President for Conservation. And I've really enjoyed getting to know Susan in my time here at AMC. She is just such a wealth of information and a champion for the environment, and we're so lucky to have her. So please join me in a virtual welcome for Susan. Susan, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Arnold. I'm the Vice President for Conservation. I've lived and worked here in New Hampshire for over 30 years and worked for AMC for the last 16 years. And most of you may know I oversee all of our conservation for the organization, which includes our research and conservation and recreation policy work. I am very pleased and honored to be joined today by a couple of other panelists. The first of whom many of you may be very familiar with, and that is Ken Kimball, our former research director, who we have pulled kicking and screaming out of retirement to join us today. But he really was the architect, not only of our overall research program, but specifically around energy siting, and then very specifically in our saga of Northern Pass. So Ken, thanks again for being here today. And our third panelist, I'm also very pleased coming in from a distance from us today, is Nancy Martland. She was a key grassroots activist and spokesperson for this incredible community effort that went on for the 9 years of the Northern Pass fight. As I said, have been in New Hampshire and worked in organizing and politics for over 30 years, and I have never seen anything like this grassroots effort that helped to defeat this project. So Nancy, thanks so much for joining us today. Next slide. So we're here to talk about Northern Pass, and you know, I have to say that usually these David and Goliath stories don't end up so happily for the Davids. But we did, and that's what we're going to tell you about. How did we get there? How did we manage to successfully oppose this Goliath of an energy project? Next slide, please. So we're going to talk initially a bit about AMC and our mission and why we get involved with energy infrastructure. How do we make those decisions? And secondly, what is Northern Pass? What would it have done? What was the context in which we had to battle this project? It was very complex with a lot of different processes and permits involved. And finally, what was the role of all of the different pieces of the puzzle that came together, from our internal staff work at AMC to the coalitions and partners and grassroots that we worked with. And the final piece will be a few lessons that we take away for future challenges, which unfortunately will keep on coming. Next slide, please. So the big picture, most of you I think are familiar with our mission, promoting the protection, enjoyment, and understanding of the mountains, forests, waters, and trails of our region. And unfortunately, there's just an inherent conflict with this mission to protect the remaining open spaces in our region when we have these big energy infrastructure projects, because so often they are focused on exactly the places we most love to protect and to play in. And we've been involved as AMC for decades in this concern about large infrastructure siting, and from the Tox Island Dam and Reservoir back in Delaware that would have flooded what is now the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, to our battle against a multi-lane interstate highway right through Franconia Notch. I'm sure most of you know that right now that two-lane highway there, one each direction, is the only such interstate in the entire country. And finally, in recent decades, as we've moved into looking at renewables, we've had to really think about balancing the impacts of things like wind farms, terrestrial wind farms, looking at mountaintops and ridge lines, and the impacts of siting them in those special ecological areas. Next slide, please. So that's really where we have to start, is that, you know, the big takeaway, I think, from this slide is there is no such thing as an energy project or energy source that does not have a footprint of some kind. And of course, those footprints are relative, but we need to be balancing them with the natural resource values and public values that may be impacted. So as I said, we've been doing this work for decades under the guidance of Ken, starting back in the 1990s with a lot of hydro relicensing opportunities, from which we were able to achieve land protection, improved river flows, recreational opportunities, and funds to continue river protection. So it wasn't about not having dams, it was about they are using a public resource. What is needed to mitigate for that use of that public resource? What improvements can we get for the public? Similarly, as we moved into the 90s to today, I was talking about wind. We also now have large-scale solar projects coming into play, but we have really played an important role through developing policies and criteria to try to measure and weigh and assess the impacts of these projects on lots of different kinds of natural resource and recreational values. Next slide, please. So we have an energy policy that is available as one of the handouts that Mark referred to. Some of you may be familiar with it. It really tries to create some sideboards for assessing projects from most to least suitable conditions for siting. And we look at things like scenic values, recreational values, wildlife, land ownership, public versus private. So it's a lot of criteria coming together to help us frame whether or not this is something we need, this particular project is something we need to worry about. Needless to say, Northern Pass hit all of those and more. Next slide, please. And this slide, I'm not going to go through it all. And as Mark said at the outset, these slides are going to be available after the presentation. But that top middle box, I just wanted to highlight because I get the question a lot. How do you figure out what you're going to work on at AMC? We have such a broad mission. So these are the kinds of questions, the sorts of filtering questions we ask ourselves when we are looking at whether or not to engage in a broad issue area or in a specific project. The nexus with our mission and strategic priorities. Are we going to bring something unique and needed to the table? How significant is the threat? Are we really in a position to influence the outcome? Can we be a leader? Do we have the right expertise and the needed resources? Those are the critical questions. And again, as we asked ourselves those about the Northern Pass Transmission Project, the answer was we cannot not take this one on full on. So next slide, please.
Great, and at this point, I'm not seeing any questions from the audience. As a reminder, folks, you can submit questions in the sidebar, so do let us know if you have them, and we'll just go ahead and continue on. So I do believe it is Ken's up. Ken, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Let's just first ask ourselves, what is Northern Pass? Northern Pass was an entity formed by Eversource and Hydro-Quebec to bid 1,200 megawatts of power into the New England electric market. And they would do this by taking Hydro-Quebec power and moving it through high voltage DC power lines down through New Hampshire into Massachusetts. And this evolved in large part because Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then Massachusetts passed legislation to procure significant amounts of green energy. A very noble goal, but the review processes that these states were using emphasized cost and not the impacts outside of their own state borders. And in the Massachusetts request for proposal for this so-called green energy, there were over 40 competing bids. And Hydro-Quebec bid into that Mass RFP using multiple vendors. One included Northern Pass, another one in Vermont, and a third in Maine. Next slide, please. Now, it's worth taking a look first because, as Susan mentioned, there's no energy source that is environmentally benign. But Hydro-Quebec is actually owned by the province of Quebec. It's a major source of income for the province. And in addition, not only do they propose their own projects, but they regulate their own projects, they review their own environmental impacts, and then they try to sell a chunk of this power that they have to outside provinces. And if you take a look at the scale of the Hydro-Quebec projects, it's actually one of the largest replumbing projects in the world relative to rivers and watersheds. If you take all of the size of the reservoirs, they would flood an area. As you can see on the right-hand side, it would be like building a dam somewhere around Manchester to Nashua. If you built a dam across the southern part of New Hampshire and flooded the rest of the state of New Hampshire, that's the area that's actually flooded by these reservoirs. And just for comparison, the largest reservoir in the Hydro-Quebec system is about 21 times the size of Lake Winnipesaukee. Next slide, please. And to fill these reservoirs, they actually have to divert a lot of rivers into other watersheds. And if you take a look at one of their largest reservoirs, the La Grande project, that actually diverts about 3.5 times the annual flow of the Androscoggin River, Saco, Merrimack, and Connecticut. If you took all of that flow and moved it over to the Hudson River, that gives you sort of a relative perspective of the amount of river diversions that's used in the Hydro-Quebec system. And because electric demand on the grid varies both daily as well as annually, they turn these rivers on and off as they're releasing that water to create hydroelectric power. And in addition, these reservoirs, because they're actually acting as a storage battery, can fluctuate as much as 50 feet per year. Next slide, please. So it's not only that these are not environmentally benign on the landscape, but there's a second important question, and that is this hydropower actually greenhouse gas neutral? When you're building large reservoirs like this in areas that were covered by boreal forest, you have a lot of organic soils that are being flooded. And as they get flooded, they start to decompose and they will actually release methane, which is a greenhouse gas about 50 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And if you do the calculations, these reservoirs emit greenhouse gases that would be about equivalent to 1/3 to 2/3 of a natural gas combined cycle plant. Definitely much cleaner than burning coal, but it's definitely not greenhouse gas neutral by any means. And secondly, and this question has come up during the New Hampshire process, but is also being debated right now in the Maine proposal that's still ongoing, and that is Hydro-Quebec actually adding new power, or are they simply going to try to divert power that they're selling to a lower priced markets in New York and Ontario and diverting it to Massachusetts? If it's the latter, it really means that Massachusetts may claim that they have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, but relative to the atmosphere would only see a small benefit from it, because as Ontario and New York would have to then backfill for this hydropower that's just been shifted from one market to the other. And it's ironic because Hydro-Quebec claims it's greenhouse gas neutral, but in both the New Hampshire and an ongoing Maine permitting process, they refuse to come down and directly testify to this in any proceeding. Next slide, please. Now, is there a need for Northern Pass power? In New England, the power demand fluctuates both daily as well as annually. And so we have what's known as the New England Independent Systems Operator that regulates who's going to win the bids each day to provide power. And it also takes a look out into the future to determine whether new transmission lines are needed or generating sources. And if a new transmission line or a generating source they've deemed is going to be necessary for the future, they call it a reliability project. And that means it will be needed to keep the lights on. And in the case of Northern Pass, the New England Independent Systems Operator did not rule that Northern Pass was a reliability project. They just ruled it was another competing project in the current market out there. And this is extremely important because under New Hampshire law, only reliability projects have the potential powers of eminent domain to take somebody's land to build their project. Next slide, please. So Northern Pass actually required three major different permits. Two of those were federal. The first one was from the U.S. Department of Energy, and it's what's called a presidential permit, and that's required when an energy project crosses international border. In this case, either crossing from Canada or from Mexico into the U.S. And because this project was doing that, it required that permit. In addition, it was going to cross the White Mountain National Forest, and it being a non-conforming use, it was going to require a special use permit. And those two permits, because they're federal agencies, were going to require an environmental study. In this case, it was an environmental impact study. And then the third very important permit that they were going to need, or certificate, is from what's known as the New Hampshire Site Evaluation Committee. And in New Hampshire, it's this committee that reviews energy projects, and its rulings can trump local rule. Next slide, please. Now, I just wanted to point out that none of those three permitting processes takes a look at impacts across the border in Canada. It only takes a look at the impacts in the areas where the project is being built. So Northern Pass proposed starting in 2010 by submitting its application for a presidential permit with the U.S. Department of Energy. And that original proposal was a 187-mile transmission line, 32 brand new miles of corridor in the northern woods, 10 miles would have gone through the White Mountain National Forest, with an additional 45 miles in Canada. And more importantly, even though it was going to be superimposed upon, in part, on existing transmission right-of-ways, it was going to require 1,500 new transmission towers. And those towers were anywhere from 85 to 135 feet tall. And then in addition, it was going to have to remove the existing power lines and rebuild them at a much higher height. Typically, those poles were about 40 feet tall, and they would have had to be 85 to 100 feet tall as well. And you can see that in the diagram as to what that change would be. So this project was going to have a large visual impact, and it also was going to fragment a good deal of what we call the northern woods. Next slide, please. So AMC asked itself when this was originally proposed, since it was a very sparse application that went into in the original form. So we were just trying to understand what's the overall impact. So in 2012, we came out with a visual impact analysis. And what we did is we took the corridor and put it into a geographic information system. And there are programs that you can use to put in the towers, their approximate heights, and then try to estimate what part of the landscape would be visually impacted and which scenic resources. And as you can see from the chart on the left here, it wasn't hard to conclude that it was going to have significant impacts on a lot of resources, such as Franconia Notch State Park, the White Mountain National Forest, the Appalachian Trail, and multiple designated state rivers, cultural byways. And it was also going to parallel Interstate 93, right from the gateway into the White Mountain National Forest, all the way down to the Lakes region. Next slide, please. And so we put that out, and we also used it to guide some of our earlier comments to the Department of Energy in that process. Later on, what became available were PDFs of where all the towers would be put, and we got tables where all the towers were going to be, but the applicant would not give us the raw data to insert into our landscape impact models that we have, that we can use in AMC's computers. And so we laboriously actually took weeks and weeks, but we took all of that data, georeferenced it, and then went back and reran the visual impact analysis by putting the towers in, accounting for the screening that would happen with forest and so forth, and asked ourselves, which natural and scenic resources within a half mile of either side of the corridor would be most impacted, and if so, by how many towers? And once we'd finished that flyover visual impact tool, which went from the Canadian border basically to the Massachusetts border, we released it to the public, and we also walked it around to some of the towns and so forth, so that they had a much better perception about what was at risk. Next slide, please. And at the same time, in the federal permitting processes, we also championed that they really needed to look at some alternatives to just the proposal that was being put forth by Northern Pass. One of those is because technologies now exist, you can actually bury these transmission lines. Essentially, it requires a trench that's about 4 feet wide and 6 to 10 feet deep. And these can be laid down next to roadsides, railway tracks, those types of things. And they also can be buried undersea. And I would point out that actually of those 40 some odd bids that went to the Mass RFP, there was actually a bid that came in to use Hydro-Quebec, but to use it in buried lines completely in Vermont to Massachusetts. So this was not pie in the sky. Next slide, please. But burial does require that it be used in the proper corridors. You cannot run this, for example, through the White Mountain National Forest, up over mountains, et cetera. It's just the topography would fight against you. And there were actually some excellent alternatives. One that we pushed very hard was, why not just bury this right down the Interstate 91 corridor that comes from Canada, goes down in Vermont along the Connecticut River, and then bring it down to where the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant had just been decommissioned, because that already had then existing transmission lines to carry it into the Massachusetts market. And in addition, we also push that the energy efficiency and conservation to reduce demand should be critical alternatives also looked at. Next slide, please. So any questions up to this point? Because what I will then do is turn it over to Nancy, because it wasn't only just the environmental organizations, but it was also, as Susan mentioned, a tremendous amount of grassroots opposition that evolved.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That was a great overview. We do see a couple questions rolling in, so thanks for those that have submitted. I do think I'm going to save them for the end because they are big, juicy questions. So I think in the interest of time, we'll keep on rolling and turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you. I'm Nancy Martland. I'm from Sugar Hill, New Hampshire. And The original Northern Pass proposal was scheduled to go through 7 miles of Sugar Hill and about a half mile of my own land. So the news of Northern Pass came as quite a shock, but it didn't take long for everyday people to get in the game. Throughout the 9-year effort, the AMC played an important role in our efforts, especially supplying excellent information based on extensive research like Ken just described. Despite the challenge of organizing a swath of New Hampshire nearly 200 miles long, as I said, it didn't take long for people to connect and to take action. And one thing I would note about the grassroots opposition that I'm very proud of, is that it was entirely nonpartisan from start to finish. Citizens, legislators, executives, whatever, operated outside of partisan areas. And that, I think, was one of the keys to our success. My own personal experience started with a dozen people in my living room. We soon moved to the town hall, where over 100 people turned up, and we never looked back. This pattern, I believe, was repeated up and down the line. Our first major task was to educate ourselves on a topic most of us knew nothing about, where again the AMC information was very helpful. Fairly quickly, we entered the federal permitting phase, which involved public hearings. Opponents flooded these hearings wearing orange and waiting hours for our turn to speak. Ironically, these hearings were an important early networking opportunity. We met each other, we learned from each other, and we forged connections. But the connective tissue that bound and sustained the opposition was a blog and email list called Bury the Northern Pass. It collected and disseminated relevant information and kept us all in regular contact, which is pretty important when you're spread out over 200 miles. Susan Shibanoff, a retired UNH professor, ran this operation for 9 years. Even though many of us were retired folks and maybe not expected to be digitally savvy, this was a 21st century digital operation. Next slide, please. Opponents' actions were far-ranging, way too much for me to describe here. We took advantage of every opportunity, but I'd like to highlight 2 areas where I feel citizen activists really made a difference. Owing to New Hampshire's small size and politics, you can note the fun fact there, it was easy to communicate directly and form relationships with our legislators. This enabled us to play an important role in 2 critical pieces of state legislation. As Ken noted, eminent domain in New Hampshire is restricted to reliability projects. This was the first piece of legislation that the grassroots opposition got behind and were successful with. Second, reforming the SEC to enable greater public input to better reflect the views of the towns and to raise standards regarding impacts was enacted during this period. And without these reforms, operating under the old rules, I really doubt we would have gotten that denied permit. Municipal participation was also very powerful. The first step that activists took was to get an article opposing Northern Pass on their town warrant. At least 30 towns did this in some form, pushed by citizen activists. With the town on record, select boards were later encouraged to become interveners in the SEC process, which many did, and this was so very important. Some towns were able even to raise funds to hire attorneys, and if you ever went to town meeting, you know how hard that is. Others took on the daunting legal procedure on their own with, I may say, great success. In the event, since municipal views were required by law now to be taken into account, that intervention made a strong case for municipal opposition that was one of the key points resulting in the denial of the permit. All along the way, activists looked to NGOs like the AMC for leadership, for information, for practical assistance, and to give us confidence. And we will always be grateful for that. And with that, I'll hand it back to Ken.
Thanks. Mark, if I can have the next slide, please. So a lot happens between 2010 and 2015. One was the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forest, which is a land protection organization, one of the major ones in the state, started to work on getting people to provide conservation easements on their land and try to raise the money to get those conservation easements, and part of the path that Northern Pass wanted to use for their transmission line. And Northern Pass had actually set up a shell real estate agent and was out buying these lands. And then once the society jumped in, it actually increased the price of parcels they were trying to get dramatically. And the society was very successful in getting a lot of landowners who really did not want to have this project in their backyard, even though they were being offered tremendous amounts of money. The second was Northern Pass tried to run the project where it crossed from Canada into New Hampshire down through the Connecticut Lakes Headwaters easement. This is a very large Northern Woods conservation easement that the Society, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and others had worked very hard to achieve a number of years back. And the third critical thing was the White Mountain National Forest had signaled that it would not issue a required special use permit if the project was being still proposed as an overhead line through the National Forest. Next slide, please. So Northern Pass now, even though it's still moving along with its permits with the U.S. Department of Energy, puts its application into the New Hampshire Site Evaluation Committee in 2015. And this is a major difference in the certification process in New Hampshire because it's an adjudicatory process where you have to submit expert witnesses and testimony be available for cross-exam and so forth, unlike the federal process where you just keep filing your letters and hope that they read them and take them into consideration. And Northern Pass, when it comes in before the SEC, makes some major changes to its application. Originally, to this point, they'd said that burial was just simply not feasible. But now that they knew that they couldn't get through the National Forest, they proposed to bury it in state roads. And in some places where they couldn't get access to state roads, they were going to propose to put it through town roads, the same way that utility poles follow state roads in your town and my town and everybody else's. But the problem was when they proposed this burial, because the route was already very problematic for burial, they were, for example, going to have to bury it right straight down through the city of Plymouth, which would have shut down Main Street for several months. And the same thing was true for the town of Franconia and so on and so forth. So they'd selected a route for burial that was very, very problematic. And as a consequence, the major environmental organizations just continued to oppose this project. And the grassroots operations, even though they had been in place for 5 years, maintained their incredible force, which, as Susan mentioned in the beginning, I, like her, I don't think I've ever seen both the size of this kind of grassroots opposition as well as its tenacity and its ability to stay together for such a long period. Next slide, please. So I will just try to summarize what happens here real quickly because trying to get 9 years into less than 45 minutes is not doable. But the SEC process is supposed to take 1 year, but it took over 2 years because the applicant kept changing its application. In addition, it was still trying to get all of its permits from the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. There wasn't clarity where they were trying to put it, was actually in the right of way that the state had or did not have. And AMC, in addition, during this process, did have expert witnesses who both provided testimony, were subject to cross-exam and so forth. Larry Garland and myself actually worked on the visual impacts. Chris Thayer, who's our AMC's North Country representative and serves on many recreation and tourism groups in the northern part of the state, was our tourism expert, and Dr. Dave Publicover was addressing many of the ecological impacts. And without going through all of the gory details, but you can see it on the left, this was the largest project that the Site Evaluation Committee had ever dealt with. Because of the changing application, there were over 20,000 pages from the applicant, 2,000 exhibits. But the big thing is there were over 160 interveners, including 23 out of the 31 towns impacted. And only 2 towns supported this project, and even those that did not formally intervene also submitted letters in opposition to the project. And this took over 70 days of evidentiary hearings in Concord. Next slide, please. So where are we in this process? Well, the site evaluation committee, after this long process, was to make its final decision beginning in February of 2018. Now, where were we? Because of changes in Washington and so forth, the U.S. Department of Energy presidential permit is issued on November of 2017. The White Mountain National Forest, because now the overhead line has been moved out and is just to be buried in the state road, Route 112, that still is in the National Forest, but it was to be buried, issues its permit on January of 2018. And Massachusetts selects Northern Pass as the winner of their request for proposal in January 25th of 2018. That's 1 week before the SEC is to make its final decision. And ironically, Eversource is on the committee that determines who the bid winner is in Massachusetts. And I won't go into detail on that. But the turning point then comes down to the site evaluation in New Hampshire's final decision. And I think many of us felt that the record was strong in our favor. It was really a question of, did the committee members have the courage to vote this project down? And in day 2 of deliberations, and I'll go through this in the following slide, but in day 2, they unanimously voted to turn the project down. Northern Pass then contends that the way that the SEC made its decision was not legal. They bring the case up in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. AMC also participates in that. And in in July of this year, the the New Hampshire Supreme Court again unanimously upholds the SEC decision. And then Northern Pass folds its tent and withdraws its ability to contest this project, as well as in the Security Exchange Commission. It also withdraws its application there as well. Next slide, please. So to quickly summarize, the New Hampshire SEC has 4 criteria, and an applicant must meet all 4 of these, and it must meet the burden of proof. And the first criteria was applicant has the financial, technical, and managerial capabilities. And day 1 in February of 2018, they passed this. And day 2, the SEC takes up whether it will have an unreasonable adverse effect on the orderly development of the region. And this takes into consideration construction and traffic issues, tourism, the views of the municipalities. And as I mentioned, almost all the municipalities were objecting to this project because it was contrary to their master plans and property values and so on. And they failed this one dismally. Next slide, please. And why did they fail as dismally? Well, the New Hampshire Site Evaluation Committee, in its unanimous decision, basically said that Northern Pass did not meet its burden of proof. It could not provide credible proof through its experts. And I'll just give you one quick example, though I could go on and give you multiple ones. But on property values, they contended that there were only 8 houses whose property value would decline by having the visual impact of towers up to now 150 to 160 feet tall within their front yard. And their experts basically said that if a house was more than 100 feet away, that is, if you're 101 feet away, it had no impact on your property value, even if you had this as a new view shed in front of your picture window. And their expert witnesses in tourism couldn't even define where the major cities in New Hampshire were. So essentially, their applicants were not credible, and that is the reasons the SEC turned down their application. Next slide, please. So, questions to this point?
Nothing small and just sort of technical, although we do have about 5 or 6 big questions that I really it's going to be fun to dive into. So I think we'll save those for the end and go ahead and keep on moving. So Susan.
Yes, I'm back. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we feel our impact was and what we learned from this 9-year saga. Next slide, please. So certainly a major impact that I think you've already heard a couple of times from Ken and from Nancy is AMC's science-based conservation expertise, that we were able to bring to the table tools like GIS visual assessments, experience and expertise in working in these kinds of processes, these permitting processes from years of hydroelectric and wind power project efforts. And certainly our work with our colleague organization, the Forest Society SPINIF, where we jointly funded and AMC specifically oversaw the work of a visual impact consultant who we hired to counteract the visual consultant that was hired by a Northern Pass. And finally, again, providing that expert testimony. Next slide, please. And then on the public engagement and advocacy front, again, you heard from Nancy, we did a lot of work with the grassroots trying to translate what we knew from our experience into tools that would be useful to people on the ground, how to write a comment, you know, how to focus on what the issues are as opposed to the general outrage that everybody felt about this project. So we really were engaged in trying to make sure that the public opposition to this was very effective. And I think we can say it certainly was. And the overall comments that came from the public into all of these processes were overwhelmingly negative, as you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. And on the legal side of things, you heard how during this period of the early permitting for Northern Pass, there was a very significant multi-year effort to address both the composition of the site evaluation committee, which was 15 people all out of state agencies, to address that composition as well as the rules under which they would consider projects. We really got into the weeds on this and spent a lot of staff time developing proposed language, sitting in working groups, and definitely were at the table. And in fact, there are certain terms in the current rules that we can point to that we drafted that were adopted throughout this process, including really important definitions of what a significant scenic resource is and what should be the requirements for effective visual analysis of the impacts of projects like this. We lobbied arm in arm with our grassroots coalitions on these bills that were in the legislature. We, of course, were intervening in the many, many hearings and in the SEC, and we were also there at the Supreme Court. I got to sit next to Ken and listen to the arguments. Next slide, please. I think the lessons we've learned are many, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but this first one, a multi-year commitment, that is something that AMC, you know, as a long-standing organization in the region, we are able to make multi-year commitments and support it with continuity in staff and volunteers and resources. And I just want to give a shout out to all of you on the phone from the President's Society, because you are a critical part of our being able to do this. Your contributions to AMC are really what help fund the work that we're trying to explain to you today. So thank you so much for that. Of course, working in coalition, figuring out who's got the expertise and what, coordinating. We've also found we've been able to identify pro bono assistance, particularly legal assistance, which can be so expensive that really heightens our ability to do our work effectively. Bill Pluff from Maine, who worked with us in the SEC process, a President's Society member who's a partner in Foley and Lardner, who offered them their assistance for us during the Supreme Court. And there's a wonderful Harvard Law School clinic that provided us students who did a lot of great work for us. So there's a number of different things here, figuring out the roles of people in the SEC process. The Counsel for the Public is a critical role. They played a really important role in understanding how to leverage these existing pieces of a process are also very, very important. But I do think that the huge takeaway is that our science and that gives us the credibility to make these arguments and make these cases in these different processes, and that we have to be pragmatic. We're not just saying no always. We understand some things have to happen, but how do we again balance the impacts with the public good and the public trust and what the public needs to get out of these projects. And finally, that our energy policy needs to continue to grow and change and evolve. Next slide, please. And I guess I finally want to say that Ken's mentioned several times, we are currently intervening in the project in Maine known as the New England Clean Energy Connect that was a direct result of the failure of Northern Pass. And once again, it's a overhead line cutting through the boreal forest in Maine, and we are making so many of the same arguments and seeing so many of the same tactics being used in that project by the applicant as was happening in Northern Pass. It's Northern Pass 2.0 for me, really. But I did want to say that, you know, the lessons learned are being applied as we speak. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. This was really entertaining. So much info. So we do have a few questions, so I think we're going to switch over to those now. A question for Susan, we'll start with you, and from Sam. Is the fight really, truly over, or is there a possibility that Northern Pass could rise from the ashes? Where do we stand?
Yes, Northern Pass, as it was proposed, is really and truly dead. They have gone and written down much of their expense, over $200 million, with the Security and Exchange Commission. This project, as proposed, is dead. Doesn't mean there's not going to be another project at another point that will propose to go through New Hampshire, that could propose to use some of these same rights of ways, but it will not be the same as Northern Pass, and we can certainly hope that they have their own sheet of lessons learned from their experience here and will not repeat it. But unfortunately, as I said, we are seeing kind of a mirror image happening in Maine, so there still is a lot of learning to be done.
Great, thank you, Susan. I want to come back to Maine in just a little second and in a bit, but I do want to ask Ken, though. We had a really interesting question here. Ken, can you speak to the strategy of Northern Pass? Like, how did they try to get this plan approved? What was their strategy? What was their undoing? Maybe you can shed, you know, Susan referenced a set of lessons learned for them. Where did they go wrong on this whole thing?
Well, if I was to sum it up in one word, I think they went wrong with arrogance. They essentially tried to buy their way in large part through this permitting process. One of their lead lawyers was the former head of the New Hampshire SEC. One of their lead consultants was the former head of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and I could go down through the list. And they really didn't take they really did not do an honest effort of trying to get input on how to make this project more viable right from the beginning when they were selecting the route. They essentially came in and said, here's the route. And then they hired a bunch of consultants from the outside, many who didn't even know the state very well, but had big name recognition. They spelled, as Susan noted, millions and millions of dollars. And I think they felt like as long as we just checked off the box, we would get our permit. And they might have, if it hadn't been from, as Susan mentioned, the changes in the rules made it a little bit more difficult to play the game that way. And there was also this tremendous amount of just grassroots organization across the state that was very much opposed to it as well. And they pretty much tried to pretend that it didn't exist when it did exist. And it had a lot of impact and a lot of importance.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ken. Kicking it on over to Nancy. So Nancy, we have a question in asking, can you speak a little bit to your personal experience as a citizen advocate? What was that like? And did you have previous experience with activism?
Well, I didn't have previous experience with activism like this, I can tell you that. When we turned the corner and looked up and saw Eversource looming over us, we realized how much money they had, which could buy them everything they needed, really. Lawyers, lobbyists, advertising, and we had nothing as everyday people. So one of the first things I remember someone telling me was, look, we're just going to have to do this ourselves. We're going to have to be our own lobbyists. And that was about as far from my experience as anything I can think of. And I really didn't think I was capable of doing that, but we didn't really have any other choice. And I well remember, as I said earlier, it's pretty easy to get in touch with New Hampshire legislators. So fairly early on, I well remember my first attempt at this. I went into a state senator's office with a colleague. I had very carefully over-prepared. So I had just a loose leaf binder with pictures of where the line was set to go and so forth. And I started to show him the pictures. And he's a White Mountains hiker, and he recognized the pictures. And he said, oh, well, we can't put it there. And I turned the page. Oh, well, you can't have it there. I turned the page. Oh, you can't have it there. And I said, well, you know, there's a possibility for burial. And he said, Eversource says they can't bury it. It's too expensive. And I said to him, what technology are they talking about? And he looked at me, his face kind of drained, and he said, there's more than one technology. So that's where what we were able to glean and learn from work like Ken provided enabled us to have the facts and the science to talk to these people. And he eventually came over to our side. So that's just one example.
Amazing. I think that's so cool how, you basically went from zero to hero in terms of this, and now you're this, incredible, pro at activism. So awesome. I'm going to go back to Susan for a second. So Susan, we did have a question coming in terms of Maine. So wondering what similarities there are with the Central Maine power battle, and what are the differences that are there politically that we have to be sensitive to? So a bit of a compare and contrast there.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the similarities, both in sort of the applicant's playbook, some of the same, kind of a sense of entitlement to be able to do this, going into small towns along the route, talking behind closed doors, getting letters of support, and then when things get more public outcry and these towns having to reverse themselves, and just a lot of the same tactics used by the applicant to try to sort of paper over the fact that their project is not popular politically at all. And similarly, in the actual construction, it again is relying heavily on outdated overhead technology, creating a new 52-mile corridor to house overhead lines through an intact forest. This is a globally significant boreal forest in the Maine woods. They are also initially proposing to go overhead through a gorge that is it's a world-renowned whitewater rafting gorge, Kennebec Gorge. And, so right up there with going through the White Mountain National Forest and overhead lines. And similarly, they've had to back down on that and promise that they will bury it under the gorge, although same questions, what is the technology they're going to use, and is it really effective and going to work? I could go on. So there are so many similarities. Politically, some of the differences are, and I don't get to say this about New Hampshire terribly often, but our processes here in New Hampshire at the Site Evaluation Committee are more robust than the processes that they have in Maine. There are multiple permits they need there as well, but the public participation, the ability to really make your case in this sort of adjudicatory process is not nearly as strong. And finally, a big change, of course, does have to do with changes at the federal level. The presidential permit process has been changed. In just one case in point, what was a multi-year environmental impact study that happened through the Department of Energy here in New Hampshire for Northern Pass, they are proposing that there will be no environmental impact study in Maine for the CMP project. So that's another big change.
Oh, that's unreal. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that note. We actually have a really good segue question here coming in from Anne. So, and actually relating to my home state, Virginia. So wondering if this is both for Susan and Ken, wondering if we're sharing lessons from Northern Pass. Obviously we're doing it with Maine, but what about with Virginia and Dominion Energy and their project to put a pipeline across the AT down there?
Well, I'll just say that, first of all, I personally think there should be a book written about Northern Pass so that we can more broadly disseminate these lessons. I know that over the years of the process, people were fielding, media folks in various organizations were fielding inquiries from all over the world, as well as all over the United States, about what was going on and how we were fighting back. So I think there's a huge opportunity if we can find the right person to write that book. Specifically around Virginia, we of course have been following that with the Appalachian Trail involved. We're involved in another infrastructure proposal that affects the AT in Pennsylvania. So it's something that we are not specifically intervening in, but we have a lot of contact with some of the groups who are, and I know that they know the work that we did in Northern Pass and are looking at that as well. So it's an informal sort of sharing of information coalition that we've developed around many of these kinds of projects in our region.
Great, thank you, Susan. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and propose that Ken stay unretired to write that book. I know that the preparations for this, I mean, really a wealth of info.
My wife has told me that if I mention the word Northern Pass again, she'll strangle me.
Yeah. All right, Ken, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I have a question for Nancy for now. So question in from the audience wondering, Nancy, now that you've seen the success of grassroots efforts, what's next? Are you now an activist? Like, what are you involved with right now? Or are you involved with anything?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of my other partners, in addition to the AMC, was the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests, the Forest Society. And I worked very closely with people there, and eventually I was asked to join the board of the Forest Society. So that's my new work right now, and I'm right now working very hard on rebuilding the buildings that burned in the fire at the Rocks in Bethlehem. So that's all I can handle right now, actually.
Awesome. I mean, it definitely takes a village, and I think that's one of the things from this fight that's so clear that it wasn't just one entity; it was really everybody coming together to make this thing possible. All right, Ken. So, question for you. Wondering if you can talk about other volunteer contributions from volunteers, like scientists, pro bono lawyers, things like that. Can you just shed a bit more light on that and how AMC was able to leverage their talents in this fight?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Susan touched on, legal costs can be extremely high, and AMC typically does not use lawyers when we engage in these processes. It's not required that you have a lawyer, but Northern Pass was obviously in a different ball game. And we were very fortunate. Bill Pluff, who had just recently retired, agreed to do the site evaluation committee component on a pro bono basis. And what that means is instead of having money that gets diverted over to legal costs, that money AMC can use for other stuff, whether it be addressing other environmental issues, trail work, that type of thing, so that it's not competing against the other objectives that AMC has. And I do think that it's also an opportunity for some of the students, like from the Harvard Law School, to actually get a real hands-on experience. They were one of the students was very helpful, actually, as we were preparing our brief before the Supreme Court. So that kind of example, I think, covers the legal part. I think on the volunteer part, and there was an earlier slide, but as Susan mentioned, like with the Conservation Action Network, many people could not, for various legitimate reasons, actually file as an intervener, but they did file comments, and there were over 7,000 comments that were filed in the Department of Energy process, and well over 1,000 in the New Hampshire SEC, and those were not redundant. That is the same person filing the same comment over and over, which you can do, but they were different ones. And so that type of involvement helps also elevate in front of the SEC, where the citizen on the street is really concerned about what's happening. And so those are just a couple quick examples of where volunteers actually do make a difference. And it can be anywhere from writing letters I'm sure many of you get letters, requests asking you to correspond with your legislators and so forth. And, from there all the way up to, law firms that spent a lot of times, as I mentioned, there were over 70 days of evidentiary hearings. We weren't there at every single one, but the lawyers also have to prep expert witnesses such as myself and be there for cross-exam. So for those individuals, it was a major time commitment.
Awesome, thank you, Ken. We're coming up just about on an hour now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. So this was incredible. First off, I want to express a huge thanks to our panelists, Ken, Nancy, and Susan. This was incredible. Really great to hear your story and share your incredible work. So thank you all so much. A little round of applause for you. And also thanks to all of you, our President's Society members who are supporting AMC's mission. Truly, we couldn't do this without you. Your annual fund contribution funds all of this great work. It funds the staff salaries of our scientists and our advocates and all this, the incredible breadth of what AMC accomplishes is possible because of your generosity. So thank you so much. I've included my contact information below, so don't hesitate to get in touch with me for any questions about AMC or how your gift makes a difference. Or if you just want to share your outdoor story, I always love hearing from our donors on that. So thanks again, everyone, and do hope to see you soon.